one question. When we romanticize, and this is something that people like you know a lot better than people like me, how often we tend to take an image. I mean, look, we do it today. I think being able to watch figures in your own lifetime have that treatment given to them gives you a good sense of how it used to be. I mean, look at how Martin Luther King has been squished into a two-dimensional cardboard cutout caricature of the three-dimensional human being that he was. Well, that's the treatment you give them all. That's what you give Washington. That's what you give Jefferson. That's what you give Genghis Khan if you're Mongolian. You know what I'm saying? This is so whatever it is you think you come from is probably a myth to begin with, and you've transformed that myth to meet your current situation somehow. In terms of the tough times and tougher people thing, well, you know, I don't have the answer to that question, but I am forever meditating on it because it seems to me, and we talked about this a little bit in the book, and I think about it a little like coyotes. And one of the things human beings always praise coyotes for in an almost grudging fashion is their adaptability and the way that they seem to rebound from challenges in a way that even if you want to get rid of coyotes seems admirable in some weird way. But we praise ourselves the same way. We're an adaptable species. We don't have long fangs. We don't have sharp claws. We're not particularly fast. Don't jump particularly high. We're adaptable and we're smart. So does that mean we're adaptable in a toughness sense? And then I'm going to break that down into two senses. One being an evolutionary question of do you get tougher from living a tougher lifestyle, but also an intelligence question. Because if you really are intelligent, and you really have to adapt to something, you're not just going to wait to grow longer claws and sharper teeth. You're going to push that with your intelligence all you can. So for example, if the Spartans decide they have to craft a society which is geared towards creating societal carrots and sticks, incentives and disincentives towards creating better soldiers for the survival of the state, is that your intelligence helping to bolster all of the cultural apparatus that they've set up into place to create, you know, almost their own eugenics system? You know, first we create these diamonds, then we polish these diamonds. I think there's an interplay going on there, right? So, you know, if you grow up in a culture where you're forced to fight a lot, get into physical fist fights, does that make you a tougher person? Well, it does if you're going to get into physical fistfights, right? If that's going to be part of the criteria you're going to need in your world, then you're going to a few fistfights under your belt is probably a good thing to have, right? If, however, we're raising somebody to go to Harvard today and work in a laboratory, I don't think you have to have those fistfights to adapt and to evolve to this society. The society does not require, I'm not going to say that level of toughness, I'm going to say that kind of toughness. So to tie it into now, if we're going to exist in a situation where we're going to have viruses like this mutating every 3, 4, 5, 6 years and playing havoc on our economies and our personal lives and all these kinds of things, are we going to develop into more flexible people, more adaptable people? I certainly think we're going to make some changes to our global medical approaches after all this in response to it. Is that a case of society getting tougher, hardening the silos, so to speak? So, I mean, I see it maybe in a more complex fashion than just tough times, tough people. But I do think maybe that's a general umbrella that all those kinds of questions fits under, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does. That your grandmother who grew up in the Depression, who knows how to repurpose everything and doesn't throw away bread bags, for example, has an incredible resourcefulness, but maybe they don't have the toughness that a 21st century high school student would, where they can sit for 6 hours to study for the SAT and other things for early college entrance exams. So,
well, and another example, if she can go buy, if my grandmother could go buy a replacement for that thing that would take her 8 hours or 9 hours and $4 to rebuild for $2, and it's right down the street at the store, does she really need that particular skill at that particular time? See, I mean, so it's all sort of context dependent. That's why the tough times make the tough people, if they do.
Yeah. It's a hard trope to give up too, because...
Oh, it sure is.
Yeah, like you said, in every ancient mythological count, there's this great figure who times have waned. There's King Arthur, there's Sultan Osman.
My favorite trope, King Arthur.
Yeah, I mean, you can just basically, I think it's a way for a court chronicler to criticize the current king, and whoever Arthur's enemy is the king, and they're kind of muttering on their breath and hoping he can pull one over the king. That's so many tropes to choose from, or just accounts like that of mythological people in the past. Gilgamesh, whoever you want. It's a huge grab bag. Oh. Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. Something else, I'm excited to delve into this area because I'm a fan of travelers and explorers. So collapse or the end being near in terms of first contact between civilizations. I could see a lot of ways to go after that. There's the epidemic, there's smallpox, which makes coronavirus seem mild, but how do you look at this type of thing, of some sort of massive shift if we're talking about first contact?
It's funny because I do find it interesting, the morality that's often attached to it, because I keep trying to figure out, I guess the first thing I always try to figure out when I'm looking at those kinds of situations is what sorts of other ways might it have gone? Could you have had, for example, first contact happen and have it be positive in there? I guess what I'm trying to figure out is if it had happened the other way around. If the people from the so-called New World had found the people from the so-called Old World first and landed on their beaches, how different is it? Or if it had been, and people theorize about this all the time, whether or not it happened, but if the people from Asia and places like China had discovered the New World first, in a sense where it wasn't like a one-time visit, but you establish regular communications, you get that pipeline going between the continents, how different does it turn out then? And all I can figure is, forgetting the good, evil, slavery, religious, all the things that are overtones in that story. I think the disease is going to be the thing that's going to be there no matter what, and it's going to be the ultimate tragedy no matter how the thing plays out. So, you almost have to look at that as the equivalent of an asteroid that had Earth on a collision course long before any of us were here, because unless we can, and I'm trying to think, because maybe I'm just not smart enough, but maybe there is a way you get first contact and don't have the disease disaster. But if you do have the disease disaster, well, you're talking about a Holocaust, no matter what the intentions of the various people in the story, aren't you?
Yeah, I think it's with Native peoples in the Americas, it's something like 80 to 90% of death rate, if I have my numbers right.
They fluctuate. Different people have different ideas about that, yeah.
And it's something like 30% with bubonic plague. So you don't have, that's what you have, whole-scale social breakdown compared to tragedy, but that leads to reform, like you would see there. Thinking about that, if you're looking at first contact where you have something devastated versus something like the Black Plague, I guess we can get into epidemiology since it's a big topic right now. Have you seen kind of changes like that on a sliding scale of 30% of people die in this population versus 80%, and how people perceive that and how they reacted to it?
Well, again, maybe I'm talking from ignorance here, but isn't that the situation with the AIDS virus? I think you see death rates in some places that don't even look modern anymore. But once upon a time, they were a lot more equalized. Early on into the AIDS virus, there weren't huge differences in death rates in different locations. Now, if you look at the survival rate in a place like London or New York, and then look at a survival place that doesn't have medical care that's very good at all, I think you still get the 30%, 80%, or the 20%, 80% difference in terms of death rates or lifestyle differences. Some people in the West hardly even, well, I don't want to say that, but it's so different than it was when it was a death sentence everywhere. And the real difference maker seems to be the level of medical care wherever you happen to be afflicted with it. Something that we said in the book, and it's not exactly on topic, but that I keep thinking about, is the particular nature of this epidemic versus other ones. Because we did have an epidemic in my lifetime. I think it's between 34 and 37 million people have died from the AIDS virus. It's very interesting to see, though, how the more slow development and progress of that disease changes the impact of it. If you had lost the 34 to 37 million AIDS victims in a month and a half or in 3 months, instead of the way it was, and if everyone was affected and the transmission was through the air, and we already would have seen this movie that we're going through right now in the early to mid 1980s. You know what I'm saying? And I think that we dodged that bullet because of the specific nature of that disease. And I think we're dodging another bullet now because I do think you're going to get reform from this. And I do think this, as bad as it might turn out to be, is nothing like an Ebola outbreak would be, or some hemorrhagic fever or something outrageously awful like that.
Talking about examples of first contact that maybe aren't whole-scale social devastation, and I like travelers and explorers, and one that I like is Raban Barsalma. He's a Chinese diplomat. He is also an historian bishop who travels to Europe in the 1200s, I think. He's like a reverse Marco Polo, the first person from China essentially to go to European courts and no one really knew what an historian was, and they thought he was like this Prester John guy, this mythical figure, these Christians out east. But when you're talking about first contact between civilizations, we think of the Age of Discovery, where conquistadors go to a civilization, they introduce smallpox, and there's
rape and pillage and all this stuff. Sure. Old world medieval values brought to the natives.
Exactly. And then, and before we started, you mentioned with Mongol conquest. For Europeans, that's a different type of first contact, because I'm sure they would have had almost no knowledge of the Mongols, even though they share the Eurasian continent, but this wipes out their civilization as well. Basically, what are other examples when you were doing this that you thought of first contact that aren't necessarily like natives being wiped out, whether it's Mongols or whether it's travelers and explorers encountering a native peoples for the first time, like a Captain Cook or a Marco Polo or others?
Well, not to be cynical, but sometimes it's not all about having a better attitude towards them or being more peaceful. Sometimes first contact does not equal wiping out because one side doesn't have the power to wipe the other side out yet. I mean, what about the Viking settlements in the New World? And you go, and if the sagas are to be believed, and if you're going to extrapolate like some people do from some of those things, they supposedly had contact, what they call the natives, they called Skraelings or Skreelings. And they would fight and of course, in my mind, the idea of Viking warriors fighting Native American type warriors is an intoxicating clash of cultures. I love that. I'm berserk for that kind of stuff. But you think about that and you think, okay, theirs is not the conquistadore, convert and die, make slaves of the natives. It's not that kind of thing. But it's also not the benign, like we hear some of the stories of you mentioned one of the Chinese explorers to the New World. And there's all these stories about Chinese trees that have been found on the coastline. I mean, there's a lot of that stuff. It's been going on a long time, and I'm inclined to believe it. And those Chinese ships from the Middle Ages, which would grow its own food in the sunlight. I mean, I love all that stuff. But if it happens, one wonders why you don't keep coming back. You know, so I do know that there were changes in Chinese emperors and that their outlook would change from a more internal focus and sometimes a more external focus. And sometimes that would happen right when the new big fleet was just finished to go to explore the Pacific coast, maybe. But I guess what I'm saying is if you're going to have the disease holocaust anyway, then you're going to have the majority of deaths and sadness, I think, anyway. Then you're going to have, even if you have the Viking types that show up, I think that only stays peaceful until there's an equilibrium between the two sides. And then I think you see the natural things that, well, I don't want to say the natural things that always happen, but I think for people who have a pessimistic outlook, it's always a lot easier to find evidence to back up your case. If you want to say that people are naturally going to start whacking on each other after a while for one reason or another. And as evidence for that, it's that the natives weren't exactly living in peaceful harmony all the time with each other, right? They're human beings just like everyone else. So you add new human beings to the mix, and I just think you add new contestants to the giant New World gladiatorial games. It might not be as one-sided, though, because to me, a battle between Vikings and Native American peoples looks a hell of a lot more equal than a bunch of conquistadores and their native allies against Aztecs.
Yeah, I haven't thought about that, Vikings versus natives, but yeah, now my mind is spinning. And when you mentioned Chinese explorers, I don't know if you've ever come across the book. I think it's Gavin Menzies about he thinks Zheng He discovered the New World in the 1430s and circumnavigated Greenland. And no way that's true, but I think it's a fun theory. I don't know if you've ever come across that guy.
You know, I like all those stories. See, here's the thing about, I always describe myself as a fan of history, but there's some areas which I know less about, so I'm more of a fan than anything else. And one of them is the wonderfulness of Chinese history, because it is so long-lasting, as you know well, and so varied that you almost feel like you can find anything in Chinese history. Like something happened once, always. So when you look at how close they came at times to discovering and interacting with the world of the Romans, for example, during the imperial times, and how close at one point there was a famous Chinese general, and they always keep changing the Chinese pronunciation of these people on me. We used to say it was Pan Chao, now it's more Ban Chao, and he's one of these great generals that leads sort of a reconnaissance in force to go punish all these native tribes to their west, where a lot of the Uyghurs problems are right now in the western part of China. And he goes and he's on this mission and he's subduing all these tribes way out there are these deteriorating Chinese fortresses even now on the old Silk Road. And while this was happening, the Romans happened to be advancing in that same direction